open your legs. I will only stop when my child is in your womb.
Ruthless mafia boss roared to American girl. Emily Carter was 19 when she was married off to a man who was almost 70. She didn't scream when she first saw him, didn't scream at his height, or how strong he looked for his age. She told herself he was just an old man with money. Weak, harmless, someone she could endure. She didn't scream when the doors closed behind her on their wedding night. Didn't scream when he stood across the room, calm and controlled. But the night the man she believed was weak leaned close and whispered words that made her hands shake, that was when everything changed. That was when Emily realized the truth. She had been claimed by a man powerful enough to break her life, patient enough to wait, and dangerous enough to make escape impossible. And once Don Alessandro Vitale decided something was his, he never let it go. Welcome, dark romance lovers. If stories of forbidden love and dangerous men make your heart race, please support me by subscribing. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers so I can bring you more addictive tales that will leave you breathless. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's dive into Emily and Alessandro's story. The Rome airport smelled like espresso and expensive perfume, a world away from the small American town Emily Carter had left behind just hours ago. She stood beside her father in the arrivals terminal, clutching her worn suitcase and trying to ignore the way his hands shook as he checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. Robert Carter had told her this trip was about business, about salvaging a deal that had gone wrong, about one last chance to fix everything before they lost the house and the restaurant and everything their family had built. Emily believed him because she wanted to, because at 19, she still thought fathers protected their daughters instead of using them as bargaining chips. She smoothed down her simple black dress, the nicest thing she owned, and tried not to feel out of place among the elegantly dressed Europeans who moved through the terminal with the confidence of people who belonged. Emily had never been outside of Georgia before today, had never even been on a plane until her father had shown up at her college dorm with a ticket and a desperate expression that scared her more than any explanation could. A black car pulled up outside, sleek and expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors. Emily's father grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and pulled her toward the vehicle before she could protest. The driver was a tall Italian man with cold eyes who nodded at her father with something that looked more like contempt than respect. They climbed into the back seat, and Emily felt her unease growing with every mile that took them away from the airport and deeper into the city. Rome was beautiful in a way that made Emily's chest ache. All ancient buildings and narrow cobblestone streets, and the kind of history that her college textbooks could never fully capture. But she barely noticed any of it because her father would not stop checking his phone, would not stop wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning, would not look at her when she asked him what was really happening. The car drove through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, past walls topped with broken glass and security cameras, until they reached a private villa that looked like it belonged in a movie about royalty or power, or things Emily had no business being near. The driver opened their door, and Emily stepped out onto gravel that crunched expensively under her feet. The villa was massive, all cream-colored stone and terracotta tiles, and windows that probably cost more than her entire education. Men in dark suits stood at intervals around the property, not hiding their weapons or their watchful eyes. Emily's stomach dropped as understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. This was not about business deals or legitimate commerce. This was something else entirely. Her father walked toward the villa's entrance with the defeated posture of a man approaching his execution, and Emily followed because she had no other choice. The front door opened before they could knock, revealing an elderly man in an immaculate suit who looked at Robert Carter, the the way someone might look at an insect they were deciding whether to crush. He spoke in rapid Italian, his tone clipped and impatient, and Emily's father nodded repeatedly, his face going pale. Then the man's eyes shifted to Emily, assessing her with the cold calculation of someone evaluating merchandise, and she felt her skin crawl. They were led through marble hallways, lined with Renaissance paintings and sculptures that belonged in museums. Emily counted at least a dozen more armed men as they walked, all of them watching her father with expressions that ranged from disgust to anticipation. They entered a vast sitting room decorated in shades of gold and cream, and that was when Emily saw him for the first time. Don Alessandro Vitale sat in a leather chair that might as well have been a throne, his presence filling the room despite his stillness. He was old, probably in his late 60s, but age had not diminished him the way Emily expected. Instead, it had refined him into something harder and more dangerous than youth could ever achieve. Alessandro was tall, even while sitting, with broad shoulders and a posture that spoke of military discipline or violent experience. His hair was silver gray, slicked back from a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his dark eyes. He wore a three-piece suit that probably cost more than Emily's father made in a year, and his hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were scarred in ways that suggested he had not always commanded violence from a distance. When Robert Carter entered the room, he actually bowed, his back bending in a gesture of submission that made Emily want to vomit. Alessandro did not acknowledge the bow immediately. He was looking at Emily with an intensity that made her want to step backward, to hide, to run. But she forced herself to stand still, to meet his eyes even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. Alessandro studied her face, her body, her clenched fists, and then he smiled, a small curve of his lips that held no warmth whatsoever. He said something in Italian, his voice deep and measured, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Robert Carter began speaking quickly, his words tumbling over each other in desperate explanation. Emily caught phrases like, "I can pay," and "just need more time," and "she has nothing to do with this." But Alessandro raised one hand, and her father immediately fell silent. The power dynamic was so clear, it might as well have been written on the walls. Alessandro owned this room, these men, and apparently Emily's father as well. Alessandro stood slowly, unfolding to his full height, which had to be at least 6'3". He moved with the controlled grace of a man who had spent decades training his body for violence, and Emily realized with a shock that he was not weak at all. Age had not diminished Alessandro Vitale, it had weaponized him. That evening, Emily was shown to a guest room that was larger than her entire dorm suite. The furniture was antique and expensive, the bed piled with pillows that probably cost more than her textbooks. But the windows were barred, beautiful wrought iron that was still unmistakably a cage, and when Emily tried the door, she found it locked from the outside. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, and tried to understand what was happening. Her father had not spoken to her since they arrived. He had avoided her eyes, refused to answer her whispered questions, left her alone in this beautiful prison without explanation. Hours passed. Emily paced the room, tested every window, searched for anything she could use as a weapon or a tool. She found nothing useful, just expensive decorations and soft fabrics, and the kind of luxury that felt like a mockery of her situation. Around midnight, she heard voices in the hallway, her father's desperate tone, and another man's calm Italian responses. Emily pressed her ear against the door, trying to understand, but they were too far away and speaking too quickly. The next morning, her father finally came to her room. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight, his face gray and his eyes red-rimmed. Emily stood up from the bed where she had barely slept, her body tense with questions and fear. Robert Carter closed the door behind him and leaned against it as though it was the only thing holding him upright. Then he told her the truth, his voice flat and empty of everything except despair. He owed money, not to banks or legitimate creditors, but to people who did not accept bankruptcy or payment plans or anything except complete repayment with interest that had been compounding for 3 years. He had borrowed to save the restaurant after the fire, then borrowed more to cover the first loans, then borrowed more still until the debt had grown into something impossible. Alessandro Vitale controlled the syndicate that held Robert Carter's life in its hands. The debt was now over $2 million, an amount that might as well have been $2 billion for all the chance Emily's father had of repaying it. Emily listened to this confession with growing horror and rage. "Why did you bring me here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you expect me to do about your debts?" Robert Carter finally looked at her, and Emily saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "Alessandro has made an offer," he said quietly. "He will erase the entire debt, every dollar. In return, you will marry him." The words did not make sense at first. Emily's brain tried to process them, to fit them into some logical framework, but they refused to form coherent meaning. "Marry him?" she repeated. "The old man?" "You are joking." But her father's face told her he wasn't joking. Emily started laughing, a high-pitched sound that bordered on hysterical, because the alternative was screaming or crying or both. "This is insane," she said. "This is human trafficking. This is illegal. We are in Italy, not the Dark Ages. You cannot just sell your daughter." "Alessandro Vitale can do whatever he wants," her father said, and there was a terrible finality in his voice. "He owns half of Rome. He has connections in government, police, courts. If I refuse his offer, I will disappear into a prison where no one will find me. Or I will simply disappear. And you, Emily, you will be left with nothing. No family, no money, no way to finish school. So you would rather I marry a man old enough to be my grandfather?" Emily's voice had gone cold and hard. "You would rather sell me to save yourself?" Her father flinched, but did not deny it. "Alessandro has promised you will be treated well," he said. "You will want for nothing. You will live in luxury. And in a few years, when he dies, you will inherit everything and be free." The calculation in his voice made Emily sick. She turned away from him, walked to the barred window, and stared out at the manicured gardens below. "I will not do it," she said. "I would rather take my chances alone than become property." "You do not have a choice," her father said. "The documents are already prepared. The wedding is scheduled for 3 days from now. Alessandro Vitale has decided, and what he decides becomes reality." Emily spun around, ready to scream at him, to fight, to refuse with every fiber of her being. But her father was already leaving, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and the door locked behind him with a click that sounded like a coffin closing. Emily sank to the floor and finally allowed herself to cry. Great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the father she thought she had, for the future she thought she would have, for the girl she had been just yesterday, who believed the world was mostly fair and mostly safe. The next day, Alessandro came to see her. Emily heard the lock turn and stood up from the chair where she had been sitting for hours, her body rigid with fury and fear. Alessandro entered alone, closing the door behind him but not locking it, a small gesture that might have been meaningful if Emily had anywhere to run. He looked at her with those cold, dark eyes, taking in her red-rimmed eyes and defiant posture. And then he sat down in the chair across from hers, as though this were a normal social visit. "Your father has told you of our arrangement," Alessandro said. His English was perfect, accented but precise. Emily said nothing, just stared at him with all the hatred she could channel into her gaze. Alessandro seemed unaffected. "I understand you are angry," he continued. "That is natural. But anger will not change the situation." "You cannot force me to marry you," Emily said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound strong. "This is not legal. I am an American citizen. I have rights." Alessandro smiled, and it was the coldest thing Emily had ever seen. "You are in my country now," he said, "in my city, in my home. Your rights extend exactly as far as I allow them to extend. The American embassy will not help you because they will never know you need help. Your father will not help you because he has already agreed to the terms. You have no allies, no resources, and no escape." "Then I will refuse," Emily said. "I will stand up at the wedding and say no." "And what do you think will happen to your father then?" Alessandro asked, his tone conversational. "Do you think I will simply forgive the debt and send you both home?" "No, Emily. I will take what I am owed, one way or another. Your father will learn what happens to men who waste my time and insult my generosity. And you will watch." The threat was delivered so calmly, it took Emily a moment to understand its full weight. Alessandro was not bluffing. He would hurt her father, probably kill him, and make sure Emily knew it was her fault. She felt the trap closing around her, felt her options narrowing to a single terrible choice. Marry this man or condemn her father to death. "Why me?" Emily whispered. "Why not just take the restaurant? Take everything we own?" "Because I have restaurants," Alessandro said. "I have property, and businesses, and more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. What I don't have is an heir. I am 68 years old, Emily. My children from my first marriage are dead or estranged. I need someone young, healthy, capable of giving me a son before I am too old to teach him what he needs to know." Emily felt bile rise in her throat. "You want me to have your children. I want you to be my wife," Alessandro corrected, "in every sense of the word. You will live in my home. You will bear my name. And yes, eventually, you will give me a child. In return, your father lives. You live in comfort and security. And when I die, which will likely be within the next decade given my age, you will inherit everything and be free to do whatever you wish." Emily wanted to throw something at him, wanted to scream and fight and claw at his face. But she could see in his eyes that violence would be futile. Alessandro Vitale had probably faced death 1,000 times and walked away laughing. One angry 19-year-old girl would not even make him flinch. So instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "What if I say yes, but refuse to fulfill the other parts of this agreement?" "Then your father dies," Alessandro said simply. "And you remain my wife anyway, but in significantly less comfortable circumstances. I am offering you a choice, Emily. Not a good choice, perhaps, but a choice nonetheless. Be my willing wife and live well, or be my reluctant wife and live very differently. Either way, you are mine." He stood then, buttoning his suit jacket with precise movements. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," he said. "I suggest you choose wisely." After he left, Emily sat in stunned silence. She had no doubt Alessandro meant every word. This was not a man who made empty threats or bothered with unnecessary cruelty. He was simply stating facts, laying out the terms of her new reality, with the same calm he might use to discuss the weather. Emily spent that night thinking about running, about fighting, about somehow escaping this nightmare. But every scenario ended the same way, with her father dead and Emily hunted by an organization that had resources she could not begin to imagine. By morning, she had made her choice. When Alessandro returned, Emily looked him in the eye and said the words that would change her life forever. "I will marry you." Alessandro nodded as though he had never doubted her answer. "Wise decision," he said. "We will be married in 3 days. I suggest you rest and prepare yourself." The wedding was held in a private chapel on Alessandro's estate, with only a handful of witnesses and a priest who looked more terrified than reverent. Emily wore a white dress that Alessandro's staff had provided, expensive lace and silk that fit her perfectly, because of course Alessandro would have her measurements. She walked down the short aisle alone, her father notably absent. Alessandro had decided Robert Carter did not deserve to give away what he had already sold. Emily spoke her vows in a voice that did not shake, looking at Alessandro's face and seeing nothing but calm satisfaction. When he slid the ring onto her finger, a massive diamond that probably cost more than her college tuition, Emily felt the weight of it like a shackle. They were pronounced husband and wife, and Alessandro kissed her briefly, a press of lips that was more about claiming than affection. Then it was over, and Emily Carter was now Emily Vitale, property of a man who terrified her. That night, Emily stood in Alessandro's bedroom, which was now her bedroom as well, and waited. The room was masculine and luxurious, all dark wood and leather, and the faint smell of expensive cologne. She had changed into a nightgown that one of the house staff had left for her, white silk that fell to her knees and made her feel exposed despite covering everything. Her hands shook as she heard Alessandro's footsteps in the hall, heard the door open and close. She expected violence, or at least demand, expected to be used like the property she now was. But Alessandro walked past her to the window, loosening his tie without looking at her. "You are afraid," he observed, his back still turned. "What do you think?" Emily replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Alessandro turned then, his eyes traveling over her with an expression she could not read. "I do not force women," he said. "I never have. You are my wife, and eventually that will mean intimacy. But not tonight. Tonight, you will sleep. I will sleep. And we will begin to build an understanding." Emily did not know whether to feel relieved or insulted. "So what was the point of all this?" she demanded. "The marriage, the threats, the control?" "The point," Alessandro said, walking toward her slowly, "is that you are mine now. Legally, publicly, completely. But I am patient enough to wait until you stop seeing me as your enemy and start seeing me as your husband." "I will never see you as anything but the man who bought me," Emily said, her voice shaking with rage and unshed tears. Alessandro stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. "We will see," he said quietly. "Now sleep. You are exhausted, and tomorrow your real education begins." He left her then, walking to the attached sitting room and closing the door behind him. Emily stood alone in the massive bedroom, trying to understand what had just happened. Alessandro Vitale, the ruthless Don who had forced her into marriage, had just given her the first night of her imprisonment without laying a hand on her. Emily did not trust the gesture, but she could not deny the relief flooding through her body. She climbed into the bed, which was large enough for 5 people, and cried herself to sleep. The next morning, Emily woke to find Alessandro already gone. A woman in her 50s entered with breakfast on a tray, introducing herself as Sophia, the head of household staff. Sophia explained in accented English that Emily would begin Italian lessons that afternoon, self-defense training the following day, and would be expected to accompany Alessandro to a social event by the end of the week. Everything was stated as fact, not suggestion. Emily was not being asked. She was being told. The Italian lessons were conducted by a stern professor who corrected every pronunciation with sharp efficiency. Emily was terrible at first, her tongue tripping over unfamiliar sounds, but she forced herself to focus. If she was going to survive in this world, she needed to understand the language. By the end of the first week, she could form basic sentences. By the end of the second, she could follow simple conversations. And by the third week, Emily realized that being able to understand Italian meant she could now hear the things people said around her, assuming she did not know what they were saying. The self-defense training was conducted by Marco, a former military man who treated Emily with professional courtesies and no sympathy whatsoever. He taught her how to break holds, where to strike to cause maximum damage, how to recognize threats before they materialized. At first, Emily went through the motions half-heartedly, seeing it as another form of control. But gradually, as her body grew stronger and her reflexes faster, she began to feel something like power. Not enough to escape Alessandro's world, but enough to not feel completely helpless within it. Alessandro watched her progress from a distance. He would appear at the edge of the training room sometimes, standing silently with his arms crossed, his eyes tracking every movement Emily made. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight, assessing and calculating. But he never interfered, never commented, never approached her during training. It was as though he was waiting for something, though Emily could not imagine what. 1 month after the wedding, Alessandro informed Emily that they would be attending a gathering of important Italian families. She would be presented as his wife publicly for the first time, and her behavior would reflect on his reputation. Emily wanted to refuse, wanted to say something defiant and cutting, but she had learned enough about Alessandro's world to know that public rebellion would only bring private consequences. So she nodded and allowed Sophia to dress her in an expensive gown, dark green silk that hugged her curves and fell to the floor in elegant lines. Alessandro wore a tuxedo that made him look like he belonged in old Hollywood films, elegant and dangerous all at once. When he saw Emily, something flickered in his eyes, gone too quickly for her to identify. "You look beautiful," he said, and it was the first compliment he had ever given her. "I look like property being displayed," Emily replied, unable to help herself. Alessandro's expression hardened slightly. "You look like my wife," he corrected, "and tonight you will act like it. These people will judge you, will look for weakness, will test you at every opportunity. Do not give them the satisfaction." The gathering was held in a palazzo that made Alessandro's villa look modest, all marble columns and frescoed ceilings, and champagne that probably cost more per bottle than Emily's monthly rent used to be. She walked beside Alessandro, her hand resting lightly on his arm, feeling dozens of eyes turn their way. The whispers started immediately. "She is so young. Where did he find her? Does she even speak Italian?" Emily kept her face carefully neutral, the way Alessandro had taught her, without actually teaching her, just by modeling that same control every single day. They moved through the crowd, Alessandro introducing Emily to men with cold eyes and women with calculating smiles. Everyone was polite to her face, but Emily could feel their judgment, their questions, their certainty that she did not belong in this world of power and violence and old European money. She answered questions about her background vaguely, the way Alessandro had instructed, giving away nothing real about herself or her family. She smiled when appropriate and stayed silent when not, playing the role of ornamental wife with the skill of someone who had no other choice. Then a man approached them, younger than Alessandro, but still probably in his 50s, with the kind of handsome features that had probably gotten him anything he wanted when he was younger. He greeted Alessandro warmly in Italian, then turned his attention to Emily with a smile that made her skin crawl. "This is your new wife?" he said in English, his eyes traveling down her body with obvious appreciation. "You always did have excellent taste, Alessandro." Alessandro's hand tightened on Emily's waist, a gesture so subtle she almost missed it. "Thank you, Dante," he said, his voice cool. "Emily, this is Dante Rossetti, an old associate. Dante took Emily's free hand and kissed it, his lips lingering longer than necessary. "So beautiful," he murmured, "and so young. Tell me, Cara, what does a girl like you see in a man like Alessandro?" The question was designed to embarrass, to undermine, to make Emily feel like the bought property she was. She felt Alessandro's body tense beside her, felt the room's attention focusing on them, waiting to see how she would respond. Emily pulled her hand away from Dante with deliberate slowness, then looked him directly in the eye. "I see a man who does not need to ask stupid questions to feel powerful," she said clearly. "Perhaps you should try it sometime." The room went silent. Dante's smile froze on his face, his eyes flashing with anger. Several people nearby made small sounds of shock or amusement. Emily held Dante's gaze, refusing to back down, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then Alessandro did something that shocked everyone, including Emily. He laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that cut through the tension like a knife. "My wife," Alessandro said, his voice carrying pride that Emily did not expect, "is clearly capable of handling herself. Perhaps next time, Dante, you will remember that." They moved away from Dante, who stood frozen with humiliation, and Emily realized she was shaking. Alessandro guided her to a quieter corner of the room, his hand steady on her back. "That was dangerous," he said quietly, but Emily could hear approval in his voice. "Also magnificent. Where did you learn to do that?" "I learned from watching you," Emily said before she could stop herself. "You never let anyone make you feel small. I figured if I am going to survive being your wife, I should probably do the same." Alessandro looked at her with an intensity that made Emily's breath catch. "You are learning faster than I expected," he said. "That pleases me." "I am not trying to please you," Emily replied, but the words came out softer than she intended. "I know," Alessandro said, and for the first time since she met him, he smiled at her with something that might have been genuine warmth. "That is part of what makes you interesting." Over the following weeks, Emily noticed a shift in how Alessandro treated her. He sought out her company more often, asking her opinions on art in his collection or books she had read. He began taking her to quieter restaurants in Rome, where they could talk without the pressure of his world watching. He still maintained distance physically, still slept in the sitting room adjoining the bedroom, but Emily could feel something building between them, something that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. One evening, they were sitting in Alessandro's private study after dinner, drinking wine and discussing Emily's progress with Italian. She had been reading Dante's Inferno in the original, struggling through the archaic language, but determined to prove she was not the uneducated American everyone assumed. Alessandro listened to her stumbling through a passage, then gently corrected her pronunciation. His hand brushed hers as he pointed to a word, and Emily felt electricity shoot up her arm. She pulled away quickly, startled by her own reaction. Alessandro noticed, his dark eyes studying her face. "You are afraid of me," he said quietly. "Still?" "Yes," Emily admitted. "You control everything about my life. You bought me like property. Why would I not be afraid?" "Because I have not hurt you," Alessandro said. "Because I have kept every promise I made, given you freedom within the boundaries of this life, treated you with respect despite having every right to demand obedience. What more must I do to prove I am not your enemy?" "You could let me go," Emily said, but there was less conviction in her voice than there should have been. Alessandro set down his wineglass and moved closer to her, close enough that Emily could smell his cologne and see the faint silver stubble on his jaw. "I will never let you go," he said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "You are mine, Emily, but that does not mean you must be my prisoner. It could mean something else entirely, if you would allow it." "What could it possibly mean?" Emily whispered, her body frozen between the urge to flee and something else she did not want to name. It could mean partnership, Alessandro said. It could mean mutual respect and protection, and the kind of loyalty that builds empires. It could mean that you stop seeing yourself as captured and start seeing yourself as chosen. Liu Aintintontom did not choose this, Emily protested, but her voice was weak. No, Alessandro agreed, but you can choose what it becomes from here. You can choose to remain my reluctant bride, or you can choose to become my willing wife. Either way, I will treasure you. But one path leads to coldness and distance. The other leads to something more. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek with surprising tenderness. Emily knew she should pull away, should maintain the anger that had sustained her through these terrible weeks. But instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her body betraying the walls her mind had built. Alessandro's eyes darkened with something that looked like triumph and desire mixed together, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to move away. Emily did not move away. When Alessandro's lips met hers, it was nothing like the brief kiss at their wedding. This was hungry and possessive and claiming, a kiss that demanded response and promised things Emily was not ready to think about. She kissed him back before she could stop herself, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him beneath expensive fabric. Alessandro pulled her closer, one arm wrapping around her waist, while the other hand tangled in her hair, and Emily felt something inside her begin to crack and crumble. She pulled away suddenly, breathing hard, her eyes wide with shock at her own response. Alessandro let her go immediately, though his eyes remained dark, with barely controlled desire. Emily stood up on shaking legs, backing away from him. "I cannot do this," she said. "You are the man who bought me. You are my captor. I cannot want you." "But you do," Alessandro said, his voice rough. "I can see it in your eyes, feel it in how you responded. You want me as much as I want you, Emily. And that terrifies you more than anything I have actually done." Emily turned and fled the room, not caring how it looked, needing distance before she did something she could not take back. She heard Alessandro call her name but did not stop, running through the villa's halls until she reached the bedroom and locked herself inside. She leaned against the door, her heart racing and her body still humming from that kiss, hating herself for the truth in Alessandro's words. The next morning, Alessandro was distant and controlled, treating Emily with polite courtesy that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. He informed her that he would be traveling for business for 3 days, and that she would remain at the villa under guard. Emily wanted to be relieved by his absence, but instead, she felt bereft in a way that made no sense. She threw herself into her training and studies, pushing her body until Marco finally called a halt and insisted she rest before she injured herself. On the second day of Alessandro's absence, Emily was practicing Italian conversation with her tutor when she heard shouting from downstairs. Guards rushed past the study room, their weapons drawn, and Emily's tutor went pale. "Stay here," the woman whispered, but Emily's training kicked in before conscious thought. She grabbed the letter opener from the desk and moved to the door, listening. More shouting, this time closer, the sound of something breaking. Then gunshots, sharp cracks that made Emily's ears ring even from a distance. The tutor screamed and dropped to the floor, covering her head. Emily's mind raced through her options. Hide and hope the guards won the fight, or run and try to find a way out during the chaos. She chose neither, instead, positioning herself behind the door with the letter opener raised, exactly as Marco had taught her. The door burst open and a man rushed in, weapon drawn and eyes wild. He saw the tutor on the floor and grabbed her, using her as a shield, his gun pressed to her temple. Emily moved without thinking, exactly as her training had drilled into her. She struck hard at the pressure point below his ear, and when he turned in surprise, she drove the letter opener into his shoulder with all her strength. The man screamed and dropped both the gun and the tutor, and Emily kicked the weapon away before he could recover. By the time Alessandro's guards burst into the room, Emily was standing over the wounded intruder, letter opener still in hand, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. The guards stared at her in shock, then quickly secured the attacker and escorted Emily to Alessandro's personal quarters, the most defensible location in the villa. Sophia appeared with blankets and tea, fussing over Emily like she was precious crystal rather than a captive bride. Alessandro returned within 2 hours, his helicopter landing on the villa's grounds, with the kind of speed that suggested he had broken every aviation regulation to get there. He burst into his quarters where Emily sat wrapped in blankets, his face a mask of controlled fury that melted into relief the moment he saw her unharmed. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled Emily into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You are safe," he kept saying, the words almost like a prayer. "You are safe." Emily should have pushed him away, should have maintained the distance she had been trying to rebuild. Instead, she clung to him, her face buried against his chest, breathing in the scent of him and letting his solid presence ground her. When Alessandro finally pulled back to examine her face, his hands gentle on her shoulders, Emily saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. "They came for you," he said quietly, "because you are mine. Because they knew hurting you would hurt me more than any attack on my person could. This is my fault." "I fought back," Emily said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I am not helpless, Alessandro. You made sure of that." Alessandro's expression shifted to something Emily had never seen before, a mixture of pride and possessiveness, and something deeper that made her chest ache. "You used your training," he said. "You protected yourself and likely saved your tutor's life." "You are magnificent, Emily. Fierce and brave and completely unexpected." His hands came up to frame her face, and this time when he kissed her, it was different from before. This kiss was not about claiming or proving a point. It was about relief and fear, and the bone-deep need to confirm that she was real and alive. Emily kissed him back without reservation, her walls finally crumbling under the weight of everything that had happened, everything she had been denying. Alessandro lifted her without breaking the kiss, carrying her to his bedroom, the one she had never been allowed to enter. He laid her down on the massive bed with a gentleness that contradicted everything Emily thought she knew about him. His hands roamed over her body, checking for injuries she did not have, his eyes dark with desire and concern. Emily reached up and pulled him down to her, done with fighting, done with pretending she did not want this. What followed was tender and intense and overwhelming. Alessandro worshipped her with his hands and mouth, taking his time despite the urgency Emily could feel vibrating through his body. When they finally came together, Emily cried out, not from pain, but from the intensity of feeling connected to this man who she had hated and feared and now wanted, with a desperation that terrified her. Alessandro whispered to her in Italian, words Emily was not fluent enough to fully understand, but the emotion behind them needed no translation. Afterward, Alessandro held her against his chest, his hand stroking her hair with gentle repetition. Emily waited for regret to set in, for reality to reassert itself and remind her that this man had bought her like property. But all she felt was safe and cherished and terrifyingly content. She fell asleep in his arms, and for the first time since arriving in Italy, she slept deeply and without nightmares. Emily woke the next morning to find Alessandro watching her, propped up on one elbow with an expression on his face that made her breath catch. "You are beautiful when you sleep," he said quietly. "Unguarded and peaceful. I want to see you like that always." Emily sat up, pulling the sheet around herself, suddenly uncertain about what last night meant for their strange relationship. Alessandro seemed to read her thoughts because he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I will not let you pull away again," he said firmly. "Last night changed things between us. You can deny it if you wish, but your body told me everything I needed to know." "I do not know what I feel," Emily admitted. "You are still the man who forced me into this marriage." "And you are still the woman who kissed me back," Alessandro replied, "who chose to stay in my bed rather than flee to your own room, who responded to me with passion and need. We can acknowledge the difficult beginning while still choosing to build something real from here. Or you can continue fighting what is inevitable." Emily wanted to argue, but could not find the words. The truth was that something had fundamentally shifted last night. She could no longer see Alessandro as just her captor. He was also the man who had spent months earning her trust slowly, who had protected and trained her, who had looked genuinely terrified when she was in danger. The situation was still wrong, still forced, still far from any fairy tale. But it was also becoming something she could not quite hate anymore. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Alessandro fell into a new rhythm. She moved into his bedroom permanently, though they both pretended it was about security rather than desire. They spent evenings talking about everything and nothing, Alessandro sharing stories from his long life, and Emily describing her dreams for the future. He asked what she wanted to study if she could return to school, and when she said art history, Alessandro quietly arranged for a private tutor to continue her education. The physical relationship between them deepened as well. Alessandro was an attentive lover, learning Emily's body with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. Emily found herself craving his touch, looking forward to the nights when they would come together with increasing familiarity and passion. She still struggled with the morality of it all, with the fact that this relationship had been built on force and debt. But she could not deny that what they shared now felt real, regardless of how it began. 2 months after the attack on the villa, Emily missed her period. She told herself it was stress, the change in environment, anything except the obvious. But when she missed the second one, she could no longer ignore the possibility. Sophia noticed her morning nausea and brought her a pregnancy test with a knowing smile. Emily stared at the positive result for a long time, feeling a complicated mix of emotions she could not begin to untangle. She told Alessandro that evening, her voice shaking with uncertainty. He went very still, his eyes dropping to her still flat stomach, and for a moment, Emily saw vulnerability flash across his face before he locked it down. "A child," he said quietly. "My child. Are you certain?" "As certain as a test can make me," Emily replied. "I know this was part of the arrangement, but I didn't think it would happen so quickly. I do not know if I am ready." Alessandro pulled her into his arms, his hand splaying protectively over her stomach. "You will be an extraordinary mother," he said with absolute certainty, "and I will be here for every moment. This child will know love and security, and will never doubt their worth." The conviction in his voice made Emily's eyes burn with tears. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was not just survival, but actual family. Alessandro had begun, softening months ago, but the news of the pregnancy transformed him completely. He became almost obsessive about Emily's health and safety, hiring a private doctor to monitor her constantly, adjusting her diet and schedule, limiting her activities in ways that would have infuriated her if not for the genuine care behind every restriction. The pregnancy also brought Emily's father back into the picture. Robert Carter had been quietly relocated to a small apartment in Milan after the wedding. His debt erased, but his relationship with Emily fractured beyond easy repair. When he heard about the pregnancy, he showed up at the villa uninvited, demanding to see his daughter. Alessandro had him escorted to the sitting room where Emily waited, her hand protectively over her small baby bump. The confrontation was painful, but necessary. Emily told her father exactly how she felt about being sold, about his cowardice and selfishness. Robert tried to justify his choices, to explain the impossible position he had been in, but Emily cut him off. "You sacrificed me to save yourself," she said coldly. "That is the truth, and nothing you say will change it. I am building a life here now, a family. You can be part of it only if you can accept that I do not forgive you, and I may never forgive you. But I am willing to let you be a grandfather to this child if you can earn that privilege." Robert Carter left in tears, but something had shifted. Emily had taken back power in that relationship, had drawn boundaries that her father would have to respect. Alessandro watched the entire exchange from the doorway, pride evident in his expression. "You are stronger than you know," he told her later. "You face difficult things head-on rather than running. That is a gift." As Emily's pregnancy progressed, Alessandro made a decision that shocked everyone in his organization. He began the process of stepping back from the criminal enterprises that had built his empire. He started transferring control to trusted lieutenants, liquidating the most dangerous operations, and shifting his focus to legitimate businesses. When his second-in-command questioned the decision, Alessandro simply said that he wanted his child to grow up with a father, not a funeral. Emily watched this transformation with amazement. Alessandro was dismantling the very things that had defined him for decades, all because he wanted to be a better father than his past would allow. It was not a complete departure from power. Alessandro would always be connected to that world in ways that could not be fully erased. But it was an honest attempt at something better, and that meant more to Emily than any romantic gesture could have. 6 months into the pregnancy, Alessandro took Emily to the Amalfi Coast, to a villa he owned that overlooked the sea. The property was stunning, all white stone and blue tiles, and views that made Emily's artist's heart sing. "This is yours," Alessandro told her, "a place where you can be free, from my world, where you and our child can be safe. I am transferring the deed into your name alone." Emily understood what he was really saying. This was her escape route if she ever needed it, her insurance policy against Alessandro's past, coming back to destroy them. The gesture was more meaningful than any declaration of love could be, because it gave her real power, real choice. She kissed him on the terrace overlooking the sea, and for the first time, she said the words she had been holding back. "I love you." Alessandro's expression cracked, revealing the depth of emotion he usually kept locked away. "I have loved you since the moment you stood up to Dante Rossetti at that party," he admitted. "Since the moment I realized you were not afraid to be fierce in a room full of predators. You have changed me in ways I did not think possible at my age, Emily. You have given me reason to become better than I was." Their daughter was born on a warm spring evening, her cries filling the villa with life and hope. Alessandro held her with shaking hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he counted her tiny fingers and marveled at her perfect features. They named her Sofia Maria, after the woman who had helped Emily survive those first terrible weeks, and Alessandro's late mother, who he had loved deeply. Emily watched Alessandro with their daughter and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. This man who had bought her, trapped her, and forced her into marriage had also given her security, protection, and eventually genuine love. Their story was not conventional or morally simple, but it was theirs, and it was real. 2 years later, they were married again, this time in a ceremony Emily chose. She wore a dress she picked herself, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her, including Julia, who Emily had slowly allowed back into her life after months of difficult conversations. Alessandro stood at the altar watching Emily walk toward him, and when she reached his side, he whispered that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever claimed as his. "We claimed each other," Emily corrected, and she meant it. What had begun as a transaction forced by debt and desperation had transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect, passionate love, and the kind of loyalty that could withstand anything. They had a son the following year, a healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's fierce spirit. Alessandro scaled back even further from his old life, focusing on his family and the legitimate empire he was building for his children. Emily completed her degree remotely and began curating for a small gallery in Rome, finding purpose beyond survival for the first time since arriving in Italy. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Emily and Alessandro stood on the terrace of their Amalfi Coast villa, watching their children play in the garden below. Alessandro wrapped his arms around Emily from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "If you could go back and change things, would you?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering the question honestly. "I regret how it began," she said finally. "I regret the fear and the force and the lack of choice. But I do not regret where we ended up. You became the man you needed to be for me, and I became strong enough to stand beside you. That is worth something." "It is worth everything," Alessandro said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You are worth everything." Emily turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting salt air and expensive wine and the complicated love they had built from impossible circumstances. She had been 19 when she was married off to a man who was almost 70. She had not screamed then because she had not fully understood what was happening. But if someone asked her now what she had learned from it all, Emily would say this: "Sometimes the worst beginning can lead to the most unexpected happiness, and sometimes the man who claims you is also the man who sets you free." If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe in second chances and dangerous love that transforms into something beautiful, please leave a comment below. Tell me what type of content you would love to see on my channel, and I will make it available. Your support fuels every story I create, and I am so grateful for each and every one of you. Subscribe and stay for more addictive tales that prove love can bloom even in the darkest soil.